The year is 1894, deep in the quiet countryside of Shropshire, England. The land is rolling and green, but beneath its calm beauty lies a darkness that still unsettles the locals who whisper its name. Rising from the misty fields where morning fog clings like a shroud, stands a sprawling red-brick orphanage. Its walls are tall, its windows hollow and unblinking, like a pair of watching eyes that never close. This was the Kingsley Orphanage, a place built under the promise of charity, salvation, and redemption. For the children who entered, it was meant to be a refuge from famine, poverty, and the devastating collapse of industrial towns. Yet what began as a beacon of hope became something else entirely. The institution's founder, Reverend Thomas Aldwyn Kingsley, was praised as a man of compassion, yet his obsession with silence and purity soon cast shadows on his so-called sanctuary. Parents left their children at the iron gates, convinced they were offering them a chance at survival. But survival was never guaranteed. From the very beginning, whispers emerged that children sent to Kingsley were rarely seen again. Their names, once proudly recorded in parish ledgers, blurred into ink stains, missing entries, and vanished files. Official registries dissolved into silence, as though the children had been swallowed by the very walls that claimed to protect them. Those who lived closest to the orphanage began to report strange sounds carried through the night. Some swore they heard choirs of children singing after midnight, their voices rising like hymns through the darkened air. But the orphanage had no chapel. Others described the faint glow of candlelight shifting across high windows, though no services were ever held at such hours. To some villagers, these were signs of religious devotion. To others, they were omens of something unholy. What no one could explain was the same recurring terror, the sense that the songs belonged not to living children, but to souls already lost. Kingsley Orphanage soon became a place of contradictions. On paper, it represented compassion and duty, a monument of the church's generosity. In reality, it was remembered with unease, a place where benevolence turned to menace. Even those who never dared step inside spoke of it with lowered voices, as if to name it too loudly might summon its silence into their own homes. And so a mystery took root. Was this institution a sanctuary for the forgotten, or a prison for souls that never escaped? Was the silence of the children a mark of discipline, or something inflicted upon them by fear, or by forces that defy explanation? The legacy of Kingsley offers no clear answers, only shadows that grow darker with time. This story begins not with truth nor with lies, but with the uneasy space in between. Kingsley was built upon promises of light, yet it is remembered in darkness. The question remains, was this a tale of failed humanity, or something far more sinister? What drives a man to build an institution meant to save the vulnerable, yet remembered as a place where the vulnerable vanished? To understand the story of the Kingsley Orphanage, we must first understand its founder, Reverend Thomas Aldwyn Kingsley, a man both celebrated and feared. He was not a caricature of evil. He was respected, admired even in the pulpits of Shropshire. But within his sermons, beneath the cadence of compassion, there lingered a shadow, a fixation with silence, purity, and the eradication of what he called impure souls. It was in this contradiction that the orphanage took root, planted like a seed in soil that promised charity, but grew into something far darker. Born in 1849, Thomas Aldwyn Kingsley was the son of a coal merchant. His childhood was marked by harsh discipline, an upbringing where conversation was minimal and silence was enforced as a virtue. His father, deeply religious but stern to cruelty, instilled in him a belief that words were dangerous, that children's chatter bred sin, and that silence drew one closer to God. This philosophy followed Kingsley into adulthood. When he entered the clergy, his sermons attracted attention not only for their eloquence, but for their obsession with redemption through restraint. Congregants recalled his warnings that children were born corrupted, and only through silence and obedience could they be molded into instruments of divine order. The industrial collapse of the 1880s brought waves of orphans across England. Disease, mining accidents, and famine left entire parishes with children who had no homes. Where most saw tragedy, Kingsley saw both opportunity and calling. He spoke of creating a refuge, a place where these abandoned children could find food, shelter, and the path to salvation. The idea of the Kingsley Orphanage was met with applause by the wealthy landowners of Shropshire, who were eager to cleanse the streets of beggars. Donations poured in. Local newspapers praised the Reverend for his vision. Construction began in 1892. The building itself was a contradiction, imposing yet austere. The red brick facade stretched across the fields, its design resembling not a home but a fortress. Narrow corridors wound through the interior, windows placed high and distant, allowing little light to reach the floors. The architecture seemed to embody Kingsley's philosophy: walls that contained, windows that observed, and rooms that silenced. A bell tower was erected not to summon worship, but to signal obedience. Survivors would later recall how the bell's toll dictated every moment of their day, from waking to eating to sleeping. Freedom was not a concept. Routine was law. At its opening ceremony, the orphanage was celebrated as a triumph of charity. Clergy and benefactors filled the Great Hall, praising Kingsley as a savior of the forgotten. Children lined up in starched uniforms, their heads bowed in silence. The press reported a miraculous calm among the wards, noting how still and obedient they appeared. But behind the glowing articles lay the first seed of unease. Medical officers in attendance quietly remarked that the children's silence was not natural. It was not the shy quiet of orphans adjusting to new surroundings. It was something heavier, something enforced. One doctor, whose name survives only in fragments of correspondence, described the atmosphere as an unnatural quietness, as though the very air was burdened with fear. Within months of its opening, reports began to circulate that children admitted to Kingsley were not returning to parish visits. Families who entrusted their young ones received no letters, no updates. Records that should have documented their progress were absent, replaced with vague notations: transferred, removed, unfit. The few who pressed for answers were met with stern responses from Reverend Kingsley himself. He claimed the children had been relocated to other charitable houses, though no evidence of such transfers was ever found. Still, the Reverend's authority and charisma silenced dissent. The church labeled Kingsley a beacon of hope, while whispers among villagers suggested it was quickly becoming a prison. To understand how Kingsley maintained this dual reputation, we must examine his rhetoric. In his sermons, he spoke often of the impurity of noise. He declared that chatter bred rebellion, that laughter was a gateway to sin, and that silence was the truest form of prayer. Parents, desperate to believe their children were in holy hands, accepted his reasoning. Many even began to mimic the Reverend's philosophy in their own homes, encouraging stillness and compliance. Thus, Kingsley's obsession spread like contagion, cloaked in the language of piety. But to the medical inspectors who visited in the winter of 1893, the reality was impossible to ignore. Children appeared pale, malnourished, and strangely unresponsive. When asked simple questions, most remained silent, staring with vacant eyes. One inspector wrote that the wards resembled living effigies, trained to mute their very existence. He raised concerns of starvation and psychological manipulation, yet his reports were buried beneath glowing articles funded by the orphanage's wealthy patrons. Silence was not only a command within Kingsley's walls, it became the institution's weapon outside them. Even among the benefactors, contradictions emerged. Lady Margaret Harrow, a prominent donor, initially praised Kingsley as a visionary, yet in a private letter to her sister, she confessed to being unsettled. There is something eerie about the way he speaks of children. It is as if he views them not as innocent, but as creatures to be purged. I fear for what his methods may truly be. Her letter, discovered decades later, remains one of the few surviving testaments from those who doubted the Reverend while he was alive. As the years passed, rumors grew darker. Villagers reported seeing children through the windows at night, standing still, their faces pressed against the glass, watching silently into the fields. Farm workers claimed they heard muffled cries during the late hours, though when they approached the orphanage, the sounds ceased abruptly. One account spoke of a boy spotted wandering the edge of the property, barefoot and pale, before being dragged back inside by a figure believed to be one of the staff. The boy was never seen again. Yet despite these accounts, the church defended Kingsley. For every accusation of cruelty, he produced testimonials from clergy praising his discipline. For every medical concern, he showcased children paraded in neat uniforms, their lips sealed in perfect compliance. He mastered the art of contrast. To the public, he was a redeemer. Behind the walls, he was a warden. The earliest confirmed disappearance came in 1894, when a 6-year-old named Eleanor Whitcomb was sent to Kingsley after her parents died in a mining collapse. Parishioners expected her to attend Sunday services with the other wards, yet she never appeared again. When her extended family inquired, Kingsley claimed she had been adopted by a distant couple, but no adoption papers were ever filed, and no record of Eleanor exists beyond her entry into the orphanage. Her case was quietly forgotten, buried under the Reverend's authority. Other children followed, names vanishing from parish records, families silenced by vague reassurances. The pattern was subtle but undeniable. Each disappearance was cloaked in bureaucratic explanations, yet each left behind unanswered questions. Why did no family receive letters? Why did no child who left Kingsley ever resurface in another institution? It was around this time that villagers began speaking of a curse. They believed the land itself was tainted, built upon old plague pits where bodies lay restless. Some whispered that Kingsley had harnessed this curse, binding it into his institution, feeding it with the silence of children. Others argued that the curse was not supernatural, but psychological, that Kingsley's philosophy of silence had infected the very souls of those within, creating a void that consumed them. The truth perhaps lies in the tension between these explanations. What is certain is that from its inception, Kingsley Orphanage embodied contrast, a place of supposed salvation that became synonymous with loss, a building hailed as a sanctuary that reeked of imprisonment, an institution meant for innocence, overseen by authority steeped in obsession. By the end of 1894, the cracks in Kingsley's facade were visible to those who dared look closely. Inspectors noted malnutrition, yet their voices were muted. Families searched for answers, yet their pleas were dismissed. Villagers whispered of curses, yet their fears were laughed off as superstition. The Reverend, meanwhile, continued his sermons, proclaiming his orphanage a beacon of God's work. But beneath the surface, the foundation was already poisoned. The disappearances, the silence, the unnatural stillness of children, these were not anomalies. They were the beginning of something much darker. Kingsley's obsession with purity had become the orphanage's curse, and it was a curse that would echo through every child who crossed its threshold. The story of the Kingsley Orphanage is not just about a building. It is about the collision of innocence and authority, the war between compassion and control, and the lingering question of how easily good intentions can mask evil. This is the origin of the curse, a curse not bound by superstition alone, but by the choices of a man who believed silence could purify, and in doing so, damned those who had no voice to resist. Every legend begins with a face, a name, and a story cut short. For the Kingsley Orphanage, that story begins in 1897, with a little girl named Clara Weaver. Clara was 6 years old when her mother, widowed and destitute after her husband's death in a factory accident, brought her to the gates of the imposing red brick institution. Desperation forced her hand. She had no money, no food, and no relatives willing to take the child in. The Reverend Thomas Aldwin Kingsley assured her that Clara would be clothed, fed, and given a chance to live a godly life. The mother, choking back tears, kissed her daughter's forehead one last time. It would be the final time anyone outside those walls ever saw Clara alive. Weeks passed without word. Letters written by Clara's mother to the orphanage went unanswered. Finally, she traveled back to the grounds herself, only to be met with stern dismissal. The Reverend claimed Clara had been relocated to another charitable institution, though he refused to name it. When the mother pressed further, she was threatened with trespassing charges. Broken and powerless, she turned to the local newspapers. In February of that year, a small column appeared in the Shropshire Gazette, questioning the accountability of Kingsley's administration. It hinted at negligence but dared not accuse openly. The Reverend's reputation was too powerful, his ties to wealthy benefactors too strong. Clara's mother's cries dissolved into silence, just as her daughter had. But whispers grew in the villages surrounding Kingsley. Farmhands working late in the field spoke of seeing candlelit processions winding through the orphanage corridors after midnight. The children, they claimed, were led in lines, their faces blank, their small feet shuffling in unison. Witnesses said the processions ended at the northern wing, where no windows opened to the outside. What occurred beyond those locked doors was never known. Some insisted it was harmless religious ritual. Others believed it was something far darker, a purging, a silencing, or even a sacrifice. Folklore began to weave itself into the accounts of missing children. Villagers claimed that if one stood outside the orphanage walls at midnight, faint voices could be heard chanting in harmony. Yet these voices, they said, did not sound like children's songs. They were lower, more solemn, vibrating with a resonance unnatural for such young throats. One story told of a farmer who lingered too long near the gates and claimed he heard the name Clara, repeated 3 times, carried on the wind. Whether imagination or something supernatural, his account spread quickly. By the turn of the century, Clara's disappearance was no longer an isolated case. Other families began to notice a troubling pattern. Children entrusted to Kingsley simply disappeared from the parish rolls. Each time, Reverend Kingsley offered evasive explanations: adoptions, transfers, illnesses. Yet no adoption papers surfaced. No burial records were filed, no transfers were documented. The church defended him fiercely, but among the common folk suspicion festered. It was in this climate that the legend of the first victim's count began to form. Decades later, when survivors of Kingsley finally spoke, their testimonies painted an even darker picture. One boy, admitted in 1898, recounted the punishments inflicted upon those who dared to whisper after lights out. Children who spoke at night were dragged from their beds and taken to underground chambers beneath the orphanage. The boy described stone corridors cold with dampness, chambers with no windows, and iron locks that echoed when shut. Their silence was not just enforced, it was absolute. Those who emerged did so broken, their voices reduced to hoarse whispers or silence altogether. Some never returned at all. Psychologists reviewing these accounts in the 20th century interpreted them as signs of severe trauma. Selective mutism, they argued, was a common response to chronic fear and abuse. The underground cells, if they existed, were tools of psychological control, designed to strip children of identity until silence became instinct. But for the villagers who preserved the stories through folklore, psychology could not explain everything. To them, silence was not merely enforced. It was stolen. They spoke of voices being taken, consumed by whatever dark force Kingsley had bound to his institution. The testimonies diverged in detail but aligned in atmosphere. One girl, admitted at age 7 and interviewed as an elderly woman decades later, remembered being led into a candle-lit room after she was caught whispering. She described rows of children kneeling, their mouths covered by strips of cloth, while Reverend Kingsley intoned prayers about purification. She could not recall what happened after the chanting began, only that she woke in her bed the next morning unable to speak above a whisper for weeks. Was this trauma repressing memory, or was it ritual obscuring truth? The line blurred, leaving only questions. Newspapers of the era cautiously hinted at scandal but never pursued it deeply. One article from 1899 referenced a growing unease among parishioners regarding the methods employed at Kingsley Orphanage, but stopped short of accusation. Another mentioned disturbing rumors of children who failed to thrive. The language was guarded, diluted by the Reverend's influence. Kingsley himself wrote letters to editors, condemning gossip as the work of Satan, painting himself as a man besieged by envy and lies. For his supporters, this narrative was convincing. For skeptics, it was yet another mask hiding truth. The early 1900s brought more disappearances. A boy named one Peter Langley, sent to Kingsley after his father succumbed to tuberculosis, was never heard from again. His aunt pressed for answers but was told he had been taken ill and transferred to a sanatorium. Yet no sanatorium claimed him. Another case involved hot twins, Anna and Grace Rowe, who vanished from records within months of their arrival. Their mother, inconsolable, claimed she dreamt nightly of her daughters calling her name from behind stone walls. She insisted these were not dreams but warnings. Though her cries for investigation were ignored, her words seeped into local folklore, reinforcing the belief that the children's voices lingered as echoes, trapped within the orphanage walls. Survivors also spoke of ritualized meals, where children were forced to eat in complete silence, their eyes fixed downward, their hands folded unless permitted to move. Any deviation brought punishment. One chilling testimony described a boy who sneezed at the dinner table. He was taken away, and when he returned days later, he never spoke again. Another survivor recalled the sound of muffled crying echoing through the corridors at night, though no child dared to acknowledge it aloud. The silence of Kingsley was contagious, spreading from the walls into the hearts of its wards. Here psychology and folklore clash most vividly. To modern clinicians, the children's silence was a defense mechanism, a way to survive in an environment of terror. Yet to those who lived near Kingsley, the silence carried supernatural weight. They claimed the orphanage stood on cursed ground, where the dead demanded voices as offerings. Each child who vanished was not merely lost but absorbed into the building itself. The glowing candle processions, the chants in the night, the blank stares pressed against windows, all became evidence of something otherworldly at play. What truly happened to Clara Weaver, Peter Langley, the Rowe twins, and the others? The records will never tell us. Each official document trails off into vagueness. Each testimony is scarred by the passage of time. But what endures is the pattern. Children entered Kingsley, and children disappeared. Survivors emerged decades later broken, their voices thin, their memories fragmented. And villagers continued to whisper of voices heard in the wind, carried across the misty fields at night. The first victims marked the beginning of Kingsley's descent from institution to legend. Their names, though nearly erased, became the foundation of the orphanage's reputation, a place where innocence entered and silence remained. Were these tragedies the result of human cruelty, systemic abuse disguised as discipline? Or were they something else, rituals that consumed not just bodies but voices and souls? The truth lies entangled in history's shadows. To the skeptic, Kingsley was an early case of psychological trauma mistaken for the supernatural. To the believer, it was a place where darkness walked hand in hand with authority, binding silence into the very bricks of its walls. Both perspectives offer answers, yet neither feels complete. The first victims remain unclaimed, their fate unresolved, their silence echoing into every generation that dares to remember them. And it is in this silence, haunting and unbroken, that Kingsley's true curse begins to take shape. The turn of the 20th century marked a profound shift in how human suffering was understood. While villagers around Kingsley whispered of curses, restless dead, and stolen voices, a new language was emerging within the walls of universities and medical institutions. This was the dawn of psychiatry, a discipline seeking to explain behavior, memory, and trauma not through demons or divine punishment, but through the mechanisms of the mind. Kingsley, with its missing children and silent survivors, became a contested battleground between these worldviews. Science on one side, superstition on the other. Doctors who visited the orphanage during periodic inspections noted disturbing patterns. Children were underfed, their growth stunted, their bodies frail. But what struck the physicians most was the silence. Unlike other institutions where chatter, crying, and laughter could be heard, Kingsley was unnervingly quiet. In a 1902 report by Dr. Edmund Hargrave, the inspector wrote, "The wards are so silent one questions whether they contain living children at all. When addressed, most offer no reply, only vacant stares. A few attempt to speak but falter, as though words themselves are forbidden or forgotten." Hargrave speculated that what he observed was a form of selective mutism, a psychological condition triggered by fear. Yet outside the medical journals, villagers told a very different story. They insisted the silence was not learned but stolen. They believed Kingsley had been built upon cursed ground, land once used as a plague pit during the Black Death. Entire generations, they claimed, had been buried there without proper rites. Priests had tried to sanctify the soil, but the dead remained restless, demanding restitution in voices. Thus, when the orphanage was erected, the children's speech became the offering. For science, it was trauma. For superstition, it was hunger, the ground itself consuming sound to appease the countless lost souls beneath. This tension deepened when unmarked graves were discovered near the orphanage. In 1905, workers digging for a new wing unearthed skeletal remains, dozens of them, piled together without coffins. Medical officers argued these were plague victims from centuries earlier, but villagers seized on the discovery as vindication. The curse was always there, one account claimed. The Reverend built his house of silence on bones, and the bones took back their due. The graves became a focal point, proof that Kingsley's silence could not be explained away by medical terms alone. Psychiatry, however, pressed forward. Doctors began cataloging case notes of children removed from Kingsley after investigations. Many were unable to speak for months, some for years. A handful never regained full speech. In one 1907 file, a boy identified only as H.W. was described as having hallucinations of voices, claiming to hear other children whispering in the dark. The boy insisted the whispers were calling his name, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in screams. To psychiatrists, this was evidence of trauma-induced psychosis. To villagers, it was confirmation that the dead spoke through the living. Priests, too, offered their interpretations. Some claimed the silence of the children was evidence of possession. The Reverend Kingsley himself wrote sermons declaring the inability to speak as a sign of demons lodged in the soul, requiring purification. Survivors later described being subjected to prayers, exorcisms, and fasts intended to rid them of this so-called possession. Science saw the silence as trauma. Religion saw it as punishment for sin. Folklore saw it as haunting. Between these interpretations, the truth became increasingly elusive. As psychiatric theories advanced, so too did skepticism. The notion of mass hysteria became a convenient explanation. Doctors suggested that the children of Kingsley, isolated and impressionable, developed symptoms by mirroring one another. Silence, once adopted by a few, spread like contagion through the orphanage. In this framework, no supernatural explanation was necessary. Fear alone was sufficient to bind dozens of children into muteness. But here lies the troubling question. Could silence spread so thoroughly, across generations, and across different groups of children, without something more at play? By the 1920s, When survivors began to recount their experiences, psychiatry had developed tools to interpret trauma in more sophisticated ways. Psychologists described repression, memory fragmentation, and dissociation as responses to severe abuse. Survivors' tales of candlelit processions, underground chambers, and stolen voices were filtered through this lens, symptoms of psychological collapse, not literal events. And yet the consistency of the accounts unnerved even the most rational minds. Could trauma alone create stories so aligned? Or was something else shaping them? Villagers continued to resist clinical explanations. Oral traditions passed down through families painted Kingsley not just as a place of cruelty, but as a site of ritual. They told of priests who had failed to consecrate the plague pit, of rituals gone wrong, of children's voices echoing in fields on misty nights. Farmers swore that livestock grew uneasy near the orphanage, bleeding or refusing to graze. Travelers claimed to hear whispers in the hedgerows when they passed by after dark. Folklore does not require proof. It survives because it resonates, and in Kingsley, it resonated deeply. Science, however, required evidence, and evidence often told a different story. Autopsies performed on children who died in the orphanage, few though they were, revealed malnutrition, illness, and neglect. There were no marks of ritual, no carved symbols, no signs of supernatural interference. To medical officers, the case was closed. Kingsley was simply another cruel institution, one of many in Victorian England, where discipline and deprivation replaced care. Yet, even as these conclusions were filed away, the haunting stories persisted. The tension between science and superstition was sharpened by the ambiguity of silence itself. Silence is both a symptom and a symbol. To psychiatrists, it was pathology, proof of trauma. To villagers, it was curse, proof of haunting. To priests, it was sin, proof of possession. Each group looked at the same phenomenon, but saw entirely different meanings. And within that multiplicity of interpretation lies Kingsley's enduring power. It cannot be reduced to a single truth. It exists precisely in the space where explanations fracture. The unmarked graves near the orphanage stand as the most tangible reminder of this fracture. For scientists, they are evidence of historical epidemics, mundane but tragic. For villagers, they are sacred proof that Kingsley was built on desecrated soil. For survivors, they are a metaphor. The living children of Kingsley became, in many ways, the walking dead, buried in silence long before their bodies were laid to rest. Even today, psychologists studying collective trauma reference Kingsley as an example of how folklore and pathology intertwine. In one paper from the mid-20th century, the author noted, "When silence becomes communal, its power transcends individual pathology. It becomes a cultural artifact, shaped by memory, superstition, and belief. Kingsley's silence is not only medical, it is mythic." This blending of the clinical and the mythic is what makes Kingsley impossible to categorize neatly. Was it a site of abuse explained by trauma theory? Yes. Was it a cursed ground where restless dead demanded voices? For many, also yes. And in that duality, the orphanage retains its grip on the imagination. Perhaps the greatest irony lies here. Science and superstition, though opposed, both sought the same thing: to explain silence. One measured it in symptoms, the other in spirits. Neither could fully account for the way silence lingered, echoing long after the last child left. Neither could answer why, even today, visitors to the site claim to feel watched, to hear whispers, to sense that the air itself listens. The clash between science and superstition is not a battle that ends with victory. It is a dialogue without resolution, an argument carried forward in every retelling. Kingsley lives in this tension, straddling the boundary between rational explanation and mythic terror. To dismiss one is to weaken the story. To embrace both is to feel its full weight. And so in Kingsley, science cataloged silence, but folklore gave it voice. The tragedy of Kingsley is not told through official ledgers or polished sermons, but through the fragments of memory carried by those who endured its walls. Survivors, few in number and fewer still willing to speak, became unwilling archivists of the orphanage's legacy. Their stories surface as whispers, partial, contradictory, yet unified in their haunting tone. In each testimony, silence is not absence but presence, a living entity that shaped their lives. To study Kingsley is to listen to these fractured voices, torn between the raw wounds of psychology and the mythic echoes of folklore. One of the earliest recorded testimonies comes from a boy known only as Arthur M., admitted in 1896 at the age of 6 and released at 13. According to parish records, Arthur never spoke a single word during his time at Kingsley. Teachers, nurses, even visiting inspectors attempted to draw him into speech, but his lips remained closed, his eyes distant. Upon his release, he lived in near total silence until his death in 1949. Family members recalled that he wrote compulsively in notebooks, but the writings were indecipherable, lines of repeated symbols, spirals, and unfinished words. Some saw this as evidence of trauma, an inner world too broken to communicate. Others insisted Arthur had been taught a secret language at Kingsley, one never meant for outsiders. Another testimony, collected decades later, described a girl forced to kneel for hours in cold corridors, facing a bare wall. She recalled shadows flickering across the stone even though no candles burned nearby. At first, she thought she imagined them, until she noticed the shadows sometimes took the shapes of children. Her account, written as an old woman, trembled between memory and myth. Psychologists reading it today might interpret it as dissociation, hallucinations forged by stress and punishment. Folklorists, however, point out that the image of shadow children recurs in multiple independent accounts, suggesting a shared vision, or perhaps a shared haunting. Silence for many survivors became both punishment and shield. Some described being struck or confined if they were caught speaking after dusk. Others said they quickly learned that silence was safer, that words seemed to draw attention from both the living and the unseen. One boy claimed he refused to speak not out of fear of staff, but because the walls repeated everything I said. His phrasing is chilling, suggesting paranoia, yet also resonating with reports from villagers who swore they heard children's voices echoing across empty fields. The psychological imprint of Kingsley is evident in the fragmented quality of survivor memories. Some accounts are riddled with gaps, sudden breaks where traumatic details were repressed. Survivors spoke of black corridors where they remembered entering but not leaving. They recalled songs without mouths, claiming that groups of children would hum in perfect unison even as their lips never moved. Clinicians studying these testimonies in the mid-20th century interpreted them as manifestations of repression and shared trauma, but folklorists saw in them an eerie consistency, as though the orphanage itself had left its own narrative written into the minds of those who escaped. One haunting case is that of Josephine R., admitted in 1901. Interviewed in 1963, Josephine described waking in the night to find all the children in her dormitory sitting upright, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. No one spoke. No one moved. She claimed the silence grew so thick it pressed against the chest like a hand. Josephine tried to shake one girl awake, only to find she was already awake, pupils dilated, breathing shallow. Decades later, Josephine admitted she still feared falling asleep in large rooms, convinced she would wake to see rows of eyes staring back. To psychiatrists, this could be sleep paralysis, a trick of memory, or a dream conflated with waking life. Yet the detail of shared awareness lingers, resistant to simple explanation. Not all testimonies came from within the walls. Villagers, too, provided accounts that aligned eerily with survivor stories. Long after the orphanage closed in 1912, locals swore they heard children singing in the abandoned hallways. The songs were faint, carried on the wind, sometimes cheerful, sometimes mournful. Others claimed to glimpse faces peering from the broken windows, pale and watchful. One farmer recalled passing the grounds at twilight and hearing his own name whispered in a child's voice. He never walked that path again. Such tales blur the boundary between memory and haunting, between the psychological residue of trauma and the folkloric imprint of a cursed place. It is telling that survivors themselves often spoke of Kingsley in terms of haunting, even when rejecting supernatural explanations. Many admitted to feeling followed by the orphanage, as though silence itself clung to them. Some developed compulsive habits, tapping, humming, or reciting prayers under their breath, as though to keep the silence at bay. In therapeutic terms, these were coping mechanisms for trauma. In folkloric terms, they were protective rituals, efforts to keep unseen forces from reclaiming them. What unsettles researchers is how consistently survivors describe the persistence of Kingsley's presence. Trauma typically fades, reshaped by time and healing. Yet for these individuals, the orphanage seemed to deepen its hold over the years. One man, interviewed in the 1950s, confessed he still dreamed of the sound of hundreds of feet marching in unison down the orphanage corridors. He would wake to silence, yet swear he could feel the floorboards tremble. When asked if he thought it was simply a dream, he replied, "Dreams end when you wake." Kingsley doesn't. The blurred line between psychology and folklore emerges most sharply in these after effects. Survivors lived real, documentable lives, marriages, jobs, families, yet carried within them phantoms of Kingsley that refused to be dismissed. Some turned to faith, convinced they had been marked by possession. Others embraced superstition, wearing charms or avoiding certain places. Still others clung to psychiatry, desperate to frame their experiences as disorders that could be named if not cured. Each interpretation reveals a deeper truth. Kingsley's legacy was not only in what happened, but in how it continued to be explained. Even the silence of those who never spoke becomes its own testimony. Records exist of children who left Kingsley mute and remained so for life. Though they never gave interviews, their silence speaks louder than words. It is absence as evidence, a void that demands explanation. Were they silenced by abuse, by trauma, or, as villagers whispered, by something that consumed their voices entirely? The ambiguity is the orphanage's most enduring mark, an unanswered question carved into human lives. Perhaps the most disturbing element is how folklore and psychology reinforce each other, rather than cancel out. Survivors' fractured memories validate villagers' ghost stories, while villagers' stories give shape to survivors' fears. Science insists on trauma, but trauma itself breeds visions and voices that blur into the supernatural. Thus, Kingsley becomes a paradox, a place where psychology explains the supernatural, and the supernatural explains psychology. Even today, researchers argue over the meaning of these accounts. To dismiss them as delusion is to ignore the profound psychological damage inflicted. To embrace them as literal haunting is to step into the realm of myth. But to stand in the uneasy space between, to acknowledge that Kingsley is both trauma and legend, is to feel the weight of its silence. In the end, survivors' voices, however fragmented, create a chilling chorus. They remind us that silence is not emptiness but memory compressed, waiting to be heard. They remind us that trauma does not die when institutions close their doors. It lingers, infecting folklore, shaping landscapes, haunting the descendants of those who lived it. And they remind us of a darker truth, that the line between human cruelty and supernatural terror is often thinner than we care to admit. Kingsley's survivors lived in that thin space, carrying with them shadows that were never entirely their own. Their accounts remain the closest we will ever come to hearing what the walls of the orphanage would say, if walls too could speak. The ruins of Kingsley Orphanage stand today as little more than fractured stone and creeping ivy. Yet around these decayed walls orbit a constellation of theories, each trying to grasp at the truth. Scholars, ghost hunters, skeptics, and believers converge upon its memory, each carrying their own lens. Some insist it was nothing more than a failed institution cloaked in religious rhetoric. Others whisper of occult rituals, hidden beneath the guise of Christian charity. Still others bring tape recorders and infrared cameras, convinced that the voices of the lost still breathe in the shadows. Theories abound, yet none align perfectly. Instead, Kingsley resists singular explanation, existing in a liminal space where fact and legend blur into one another. The first and most academically grounded theory is that Kingsley represents a case of institutional abuse carefully hidden by church authorities. Supporters of this view point to the documented evidence: malnourished children, missing medical reports, vanished parish registries. They argue that Kingsley was simply another cog in the machinery of Victorian cruelty, where orphans were silenced by beatings, starvation, and neglect. The silence of the children in this interpretation is not supernatural at all, but the predictable consequence of terror. Selective mutism, dissociation, and post-traumatic withdrawal explain the symptoms described by both inspectors and survivors. The cover-up, critics argue, came not from demons but from church officials unwilling to expose their own failings. Kingsley then becomes a cautionary tale of power unaccountable, of vulnerable children crushed beneath institutional indifference. Yet, this rational framework fails to account for the consistency of the strange accounts. The shadows flickering on walls without light, the songs without mouths, the whispered names carried on the wind. Enter the second theory, that Kingsley was the site of occult rituals disguised as discipline. Proponents suggest that Reverend Thomas Aldwyn Kingsley's obsession with silence was more than theological rigidity. It was ritualistic. Silence in many occult traditions is a form of sacrifice, a way of binding power. By enforcing muteness, Kingsley may have been orchestrating a ritual of collective energy. Children's voices locked away, offered to something unseen. The discovery of unmarked graves only strengthens this suspicion. Skeptics argue these were plague pits, but believers see them as offerings, each body a vessel in a larger rite. If so, the haunting is not metaphor but residue, the echo of rituals carved into the very foundation of the orphanage. Paranormal investigators, particularly those drawn in the late 20th century, bring a third perspective, that Kingsley is a cursed site, still resonating with voices stolen long ago. Numerous investigations claim to have captured recordings of whispers, children singing, or even direct pleas for release. Some visitors report hearing their names spoken softly in the dark, while others describe the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Theories of residual haunting suggest that trauma leaves imprints on places, looping endlessly like broken records. Kingsley, in this sense, is a phonograph of pain, replaying the terror of its wards for anyone willing to listen. Skeptics dismiss such recordings as pareidolia, random noise shaped into meaning by the brain, but the consistency across decades unsettles even hardened debunkers. What complicates matters is how contradictory these theories remain. Institutional abuse explains the silence but not the folklore. Occult ritual explains the folklore but not the medical records. Haunting explains the persistence of voices but not the political convenience of vanished documents. Each theory seems to illuminate part of Kingsley, while leaving the rest in shadow. Perhaps this is why the orphanage continues to haunt our imagination, not because one explanation satisfies, but because none do. Scholars often emphasize the fragmentation of evidence. Parish records vanish, official registries blur into ink stains, and testimonies conflict. This fragmentation itself fuels myth. One historian, Dr. Helen Stroud, remarked, "It is the absence of record that makes Kingsley fertile for the imagination." Silence in history creates space for legend, and Kingsley is silence embodied. Thus, the orphanage becomes not only a site of trauma, but also a canvas onto which society projects its fears, of institutional failure, of hidden ritual, of restless spirits. Folklore scholars take this further, suggesting that the persistence of multiple theories is not accidental but essential. Kingsley exists in what they call the mythic gap, a space where contradictions are not resolved but sustained. The silence of the children is simultaneously psychological, spiritual, and supernatural. To reduce it to one interpretation is to strip it of power. Instead, Kingsley thrives precisely because it cannot be pinned down. Each generation revives the story in new terms. The Victorians feared sin and possession, early psychiatrists spoke of hysteria, and today's audiences hear echoes of ritual abuse and paranormal residue. The orphanage morphs with time, yet always remains darkly magnetic. Even skeptics who reject haunting and ritual alike cannot dismiss Kingsley entirely. Their theory rests on the allure of moral panic. They argue that Kingsley became a legend precisely because it embodied every anxiety of its age: fears of disease from plague pits, distrust of clergy during scandals, and the Victorian obsession with silence as discipline. According to this view, Kingsley is not unique but archetypal, a mirror reflecting society's darkest worries. If this is true, then Kingsley matters not because of what happened inside its walls, but because of what it represents in cultural memory. And yet, skeptics stumble against one final obstacle: the living testimonies of those who endured Kingsley. Survivors' accounts, fragmented though they are, remain too vivid to ignore. Their memories of silent dormitories, shadow children, and songs without mouths cannot be dismissed entirely as fabrication. Even when filtered through trauma, their testimonies anchor the theories in lived experience. This is where rationalism falters, in the face of memory that feels too real, too consistent, to be reduced to myth. Some contemporary theorists propose a synthesis. They suggest Kingsley may have been a site of genuine abuse compounded by folkloric interpretations and supernatural resonance. Trauma, in this view, does not merely produce symptoms. It bleeds into the environment, shaping how spaces feel and sound. Kingsley, then, is both institution and haunting, both psychology and curse. Its power lies not in choosing one theory, but in refusing to choose at all. The myth-making continues in the modern era. Documentaries, podcasts, and ghost hunting shows flock to Kingsley's ruins, each layering new interpretations atop old ones. Theories are rehearsed for the camera. One expert insists on possession, another on child psychology, another on unholy ritual. Viewers are left not with certainty but with choice, and perhaps that is the point. Kingsley has become a stage where science, religion, and folklore perform together, each speaking in contradiction, none silencing the others. Ultimately, the theories surrounding Kingsley tell us as much about ourselves as they do about the orphanage. Do we prefer rational explanations, even when they leave gaps? Do we crave supernatural answers, even when they strain belief? Or do we dwell in the uneasy middle, where silence itself resists definition? The orphanage forces this confrontation. It asks us not what happened, but how we explain what cannot be fully explained. Perhaps this is the truest theory of all, that Kingsley was never meant to be understood. Its silence was not only the children's but the story's itself, a silence that resists resolution. In this sense, every theory is correct and every theory is false. Abuse happened. Rituals may have happened. Haunting continues to be reported. And through it all, the silence remains. Today, Kingsley Orphanage exists only as crumbling ruins smothered in ivy, its walls sagging into the soil, its windows like hollow sockets staring into nothing. Time has reclaimed the building, yet silence clings to it more stubbornly than the ivy, more enduringly than the stone. Where once children's footsteps echoed, there is now only the hush of wind and the occasional call of a bird. The world has moved forward, yet Kingsley remains frozen, a monument to absence. The children's names have long since vanished from parish records. Their graves, if graves exist at all, are unmarked, their voices lost to memory. Psychologists insist the silence was the predictable response to overwhelming trauma. Children so oppressed, so beaten into submission, that their very identities dissolved into muteness. To them, Kingsley is a study in institutional cruelty and the human mind's desperate retreat into wordless survival. Priests, however, paint another picture. Some describe the silence as divine punishment, a manifestation of judgment upon a community that failed its most vulnerable. Others call it possession, a darkness mistaken for discipline. Folklorists whisper still darker possibilities, that the land itself demanded quiet, that ancient soil swallowed voices the way it swallows rain, holding them until they seep out again in whispers. And what of the witnesses? Some nights travelers claim to hear faint humming in the air, soft as a lullaby, broken as though carried from very far away. Others insist it is nothing more than imagination, the mind's attempt to give shape to unease when walking alone among ruins. Yet recordings have surfaced, scratchy tapes said to contain children's laughter or murmured prayers. Debunkers call it pareidolia, patterns mistaken for voices in static. Believers swear the children never left. The truth? It remains as buried as the missing records, and as elusive as the shadowed faces once seen at Kingsley's broken windows. Every theory, abuse, ritual, haunting, offers an answer but never the answer. Each leaves gaps that silence alone seems to fill. That silence, oppressive and stubborn, is the orphanage's most enduring legacy. It is not a silence of peace but of weight, pressing down on the imagination, demanding interpretation yet never yielding clarity. Perhaps the voices were never real at all. Perhaps they exist only in the echo chamber of human fear, projected onto ruined walls and hollow halls. Or perhaps the children are still there, not resting, not gone, but circling endlessly in the shadows of their final home. The debate is destined to continue because Kingsley offers no closure, no confession, only a void where history should be. And so we are left not with answers but with silence, a silence heavy enough to endure centuries, strong enough to outlive reason, faith, and folklore. It lingers like a question that cannot be spoken aloud, a reminder that some mysteries do not resolve, they wait. Kingsley's silence is not absence but presence, and in that presence the mystery endures.